Hello and welcome to another video and podcast from Fantasy Football Scout. My name is David and today we are going to be continuing our FPL Scout Report series where we have a look at players who are new to the Premier League, players who've moved from one Premier League club to another, and in some cases, new managers at those teams. And today we're going to be having a look at a player who has changed clubs from one side of London to the other, and that is of course Kai Havertz, who has moved from Chelsea to Arsenal in one of the biggest high-profile transfers or inter-Premier League transfers of the summer so far. And what impact that's going to have on FPL? Is that going to impact some of the players at Arsenal? Is he finally going to be an FPL asset worth considering after what we have to say has been largely an underwhelming and disappointing time at Chelsea? Those are the questions that are on your lips right now. So let's dive right in and find out the answer to those questions. Now, just before I do start, I do want to signpost everybody back to fantasyfootballscout.co.uk to the Scout Report series from the editorial department, written by Neil and by Tom and by Mark. And today we're going to be using Tom's article on Kai Havertz very much as the basis for the information that we've got here. So if you want any of this in more detail, then you can head there to check it all out. So Kai Havertz in FPL, has he really been that much of an exciting asset for us? At times, yes. But then, of course, that's usually been before the deadline. After the deadline, not so much. I think we can all remember Gameweek 9 from a couple of years ago, that famous week when we all captained him and Salah did the business. And so, yeah, that's really been the story of his FPL career so far. So he joined Chelsea in 2020, and since that time he's made 91 Premier League appearances for the Blues, just 19 goals. I hadn't realised it was as low as that. I mean, it's incredible, and just 11 assists. Now, the thing is that he had some good moments, but they didn't always really help us out. So, for example, he did, of course, score the winning goal against Man City in the Champions League final in 2021, but his time in Chelsea, it's been very, very difficult to evaluate it as anything other than a bit disappointing. But there are a number of factors here that I would probably insist not entirely his fault, and I think that it's worth remembering that when we're assessing his potential at Arsenal. So, you know, £80 million was the price tag that was paid for him, which in today's market isn't as much as it used to be, but it's still a big number, and you could argue there's a bit of pressure there. And interestingly enough, he seems to have acknowledged that himself, because he actually described his first 6 months at Chelsea since moving there from Germany as the most challenging of his career. And it can actually be very easy to forget that COVID actually hit him harder than most. So he had COVID, and interestingly enough, ended up having a strain of it that was just a lot worse than other people, and it kind of sounds like he kind of also had a bit of long COVID as well. Getting back up to full speed after having COVID for him was a lot worse than some of the other people in the Premier League who had it and shook it off, for example. And so there's that factor as well, which is easy to forget because COVID feels like a distant memory at this point. But that really sort of set the tone in many ways for his time at Chelsea, and it was sort of almost on the back foot from the very beginning. And then move forward into the 2022-23 season, and it was all over the place. Again, not really anything that's to do with his fault, really. So 3 different managers, Tuchel, Potter and Lampard. The first 2 of those, very big on rotation, Potter especially. And so just 7 goals from 30 Premier League starts in the most recent season, having played just so many different positions and being benched and put back on again, and just never really got the opportunity to really hit the ground running. And so all of that has contributed to, for the most part, a pretty rubbish set of numbers in terms of XG underperformance. In fact, he's actually underperformed against his XG in every single Premier League campaign he's had so far, with the most recent one being the very worst. So, should have scored 11.6 goals according to the XG numbers, only put away 7 of those, and so his XG delta of minus 4.6 was his worst of all 3 seasons, minus 1.54 in his first campaign, 0.63 in the second one as well. And so, yeah, very much a player that was afforded some chances, couldn't put them away. That seemed to eventually affect him, almost in the same way as it sort of did with Timo Werner as well. Couldn't quite finish his dinner. And that very much is the reputation of the player as he moves to Arsenal. However, he was being played in a position that, could argue, was not necessarily his best position. We're going to look at that in more detail in a second. He was used as a number 9, but actually ended up being Chelsea's top creator last time out. And so he had 38 key passes And you also have to factor in here the fact that everybody else around him had a very bad season as well. So from those 38 key passes, only managed to get 1 assist, despite being the team's top creator. And we saw enough of Chelsea last season, didn't we, to see that it wasn't just Havertz who was struggling to put his chances away. Everybody else had that problem as well. And so the lack of quality around him also impacted his assist potential as well. But we did talk about where he was used, and this is very much what we're going to talk about now, because as he moves to Arsenal, you would imagine that life as a sort of versatile quasi centre forward / number 10, whatever his role was in Chelsea over a number of different years, might be the end of that, you'd like to think, especially for him. So Kai Havertz himself has very much said that he's a midfield player who likes to go in the box. Hasn't said, I want to play centre forward, which is quite important there. And so, he was excelling as an attacking midfielder at Bayer Leverkusen, and then coming to Chelsea, spent a lot of time as a centre forward, as we said, and they've got a heat map on the screen, or rather, an average position map, showing his average position by Gameweek in the 2022-23 season, and as you can see, very much leading the line for Chelsea in that time. And the problem is, despite being not really that much of a natural number 9, he was still getting put in that position, even though it's not really what he's good at. And again, we've got another quote just on that from Havertz himself, where he said, I don't have a favourite position. I know I'm not a real number 9, just waiting in the box and doing headers. I want to be influential in the game, get the ball, drop sometimes into midfield and start attacks there. And so I still kind of feel like it's very, very important that we remember that his role at Chelsea was never really what he wanted. And if we're looking at him coming to Arsenal and thinking, that's kind of underwhelming as an FPL asset, he's not going to be used in anywhere near the same role at Arsenal, and that's probably going to be good for him. Now, in a way, his disadvantage is his versatility, and he wouldn't be the first Premier League player to be versatile in lots of different roles, and then that count against them in terms of finding somewhere they can just play every week, because he is capable of playing as a number 10. He can play across the forward line as well, or as a central midfielder. But it could be that a slightly deeper role at Arsenal could be what helps him unlock his potential. He works very hard off the ball, and I have to say, whenever I've watched him play, and I'm not looking at it with an FPL hat on, what he does off the ball has always impressed me. His passing ability is quite good, and he's technically very good on the ball as well, which is something that Tuchel has pointed out before. He made comparisons with Bergkamp, Van Persie, Berbatov kind of player. To use Tuchel's exact words, he can play in the half position because he has good runs. He also feels free from the number 9, creates overloads to one side, and arrives in the 6-yard box and has a good timing for it. One other thing that's also worth pointing out, kind of a bit of a footnote, but we've got some decent stats for it on the screen, is that Havertz actually not bad in the air, and I hadn't even really noticed myself. He's actually 6'2". Every Premier League player looks tall, to be honest, and so they all sort of hide the players who aren't quite 6'6". 6'2" Havertz is, and so actually he had 24 headed goal attempts last season, which is actually the 6th best among all FPL players. So the only Premier League players who had more headed attempts on goal than Havertz last season were Tarkowski, Haaland, Cher, Kane, and Mitrovic. So do look out for that as well. There's a possibility that he could be a threat with set pieces for Arsenal. But speaking of Arsenal, let's look at the context of what he's arriving in, because it's all change. It's like when you arrive at the station, you arrive at a London terminal, the journey is done and you're going to have to go find yourself a different train. And that is exactly what's going to have to happen with Havertz, because the chances of him having to play centre forward at Arsenal are very, very slim at this point, because they've got Gabriel Jesus around, Martinelli can play up front as well. He has not come here to do what he has been doing at Chelsea, as we've already said. And crucially, Arteta has said, Kai is a player of top quality, he has great versatility, and is an intelligent player. He will bring a huge amount of extra strength to our midfield and variety to our play. So, pretty much on the nose there from Arteta that he is going to be a midfielder for Arsenal. And what we're hearing on the grapevine, specifically reported in The Athletic, is that Havertz is actually quite likely to replace Granit Xhaka on the left-sided central midfield role. And so what we've done is we've had a look at that heat map for that particular role to maybe give us an idea of where Havertz is going to fit in at Arsenal. So the thing about Xhaka is that while on the surface you might hear that name and think, oh, okay, Havertz is going to come in and play the Xhaka role, not interested in FPL at all. That would be accurate if we're talking about FPL before last season. it's very in vogue right now to play inverted fullbacks. That's what all the cool kids are up to these days in football management. Guardiola and Arteta especially, and Zinchenko has very much been pushing in to central midfield, which allows Xhaka to push even further forward, knowing that Zinchenko is standing where he used to stand. And as you can see from the heat map on the screen right now, we've got a massive chunk of red in the number 8 position. Anyone who has watched our video on Kovacic and Gundogan will see that actually this is a very, very similar heat map to Gundogan. So if you haven't had a chance to check out that video yet, go back and check out the Kovacic video so you can see what the heat map was for Gundogan. This is very similar. We've got slightly fewer touches in that defensive third than you would expect from a player like Xhaka, who historically has had to cover back. And what's missing from the defensive third, like lift that blob of red up and stick it forward in the box. And that's what we can see here, is that those touches curling into the box, lots of penalty box entries from the left-hand side, and that's all because of Zinchenko and Arteta, I should say, asking Zinchenko to push in, allowing Xhaka to push forward. And what that did was that allowed Xhaka to get 7 goals, 8 assists last season, and actually racked up the same number of big chances as Ødegaard with a total of 9. And so this role that Havertz is likely to come into play actually has a lot of potential. Xhaka obviously could offer a lot more value because he was priced very cheap, and we'd be very surprised if we saw Havertz coming in as a 5.5 million midfielder. But it's just to let you know that the Xhaka role at Arsenal has a lot of FPL potential, and if Havertz plays it, then that could be good for him. It's going to allow him to sort of face the opposition's goal rather than have his back to it. Making runs in beyond the last man. But the big question, though, is whether or not he can replicate the defensive side of things. We think we can all say that he's going to do very, very well, possibly even better than Xhaka in terms of the attacking stuff of the game, because Havertz naturally is an attacker. So what it might come down to in terms of how often he's able to play this role, and it would work for Arsenal, is how he can replicate that defensive side of the game. Because if you think about it, Jesus, Havertz, Ødegaard, Saka and Martinelli all on the pitch at the same time, that is very top-heavy. And so there is the possibility, we just have to just mention at this point as a bit of a caveat, that there could be some rotation there if Arteta felt that those 5 couldn't be on the pitch at the same time. Alternatively, Havertz maybe spends some of the summer working hard on the defensive side of his game and is able to do some of the dirty work that Xhaka was able to do. Possibly. So that's something just to consider. But on the whole, if Xhaka was to, if Havertz was to play the Xhaka role, it's by no means an area that's going to limit his ability to have an impact on the game. And if anything, could free him up a little bit, because there was a lot of focus on Havertz. With him having to lead the line specifically at Chelsea, and all of the weight and the burden of what it means to be a Chelsea number 9. It's even worse when you actually have that number on the back of your shirt, which he sort of did as number 29. All of that weight on your shoulders can be really difficult, and we've seen a lot of players struggle with the pressure of that role. Going into Arsenal, where he's got a lot of high-performing players in good form, shouldering the responsibility for attacking work. You've got centre forward in Jesus, who he leads the line. He's the big man that everybody's looking to for the goals in terms of who's the centre forward. So that pressure's taken off him. But at the same time, it's an attack that is very multifaceted, and by no means do they rely on Jesus for the goals either. And so being part of a sort of more of a conglomerate of goal scoring achievement rather than being the spearhead of it could be exactly what he needs to actually get his confidence back. And so I'm relatively confident that we'll talk about this, specifically the FPL implications, in a minute. But just from a footballing perspective, I'm relatively confident that Havertz can actually have quite a good time at Arsenal, just because I think it'd be a nice fresh start and an opportunity to play a different role more suited to what he's best at. And I think that's going to be what he needs personally. But we talked about FPL prospects. What do we think this is going to mean for FPL? What we definitely know is that he hasn't lived up to his potential so far, and so he does come to Arsenal with a black mark against his name amongst casual managers at the very least, and probably the more hardcore ones of you as well, for all of the reasons we've already discussed. But coming into an Arsenal attack, scored 88 Premier League goals this season, you would at the very least have to say that his numbers are going to improve. We should see him getting more attacking returns this season. But the question is, how can he compete with Saka, Ødegaard, Martinelli and Jesus, for FPL potential? 3 of those made our FPL team of the season last year, or rather the year just finished. Jesus probably would have made it if he hadn't got that injury, because he was just on fire before he went into it and then was very, very good when he came out the other side. And so, in order for him to be able to provide value for FPL managers, he's really got to offer up more than some of those big names. So we'll talk about their prices in a minute, because it could come down to that. But in terms of their specific numbers, let's see how they compare. Now, this is a bit of a skewed comparison, of course, because we've got 4 of these guys all played at Arsenal last year, and Havertz at Chelsea had a very bad year. There's a couple of things here where he's able to show, green shoots of hope. But for the most part, it's not an amazing comparison. So in terms of minutes per goal, one every 367.9 minutes. That was way off these other 4. Saka on 226.6, Ødegaard on 207.2, Martinelli on 185.5, and Jesus on 186.8. So he's miles off there. But in a way, it wasn't for lack of trying. So the underlying stats are mildly more encouraging than just goals. So minutes per shot, he had a shot every 36.3 minutes in a pretty poor team, which wasn't far off Saka on 35.6, Martinelli on 35.2, and Ødegaard on 33.4. And so the only player who was yards clear of him for this stat amongst those other Arsenal players was Jesus on 26.7. Shots in the box, it's sort of a similar story. One every 40.9 for Hazard last year, which is Havertz for Havertz last year. 47.3 for Saka, 66.1 for Ødegaard, 44.9 for Martinelli. And so then Jesus, miles ahead on 28.2. So Jesus, the only one better for that stat. Shots on target, again, similar story. I had a shot on target every 80.5 minutes. Jesus was 64.2, and then Saka, Ødegaard, and Martinelli were 102.3, 100.3, and 92.8. So all of them worse than Havertz. Then in terms of the XG, his minutes per XG last year, Havertz was 222. And then Saka, 277.3. Ødegaard, 310.8. Martinelli, 298.3. And then Jesus, 148.7. So again, another stat. Jesus, the only one with the better numbers there. And then expected assists, though, miles off. Havertz is just a million miles off here. He had a minutes per expected assist of 933. Saka 546, Ødegaard 402.1, Martinelli 399.9, and Jesus 716. So miles off there. Now, what those numbers really tell the story of is someone playing centre forward. Someone shooting a lot of the time, someone having lots of shots in the box, having a relatively solid number for shots on target, decent XG, rubbish XA. That's a centre forward right there. Now, you would expect him to not be so heavily involved, specifically in the shots, if he's going to play this Xhaka role. But, as we already pointed out, the number of big chances afforded to Ødegaard was exactly the same number of big chances afforded to Xhaka. So, if he's playing in that role, he's still going to have, shots. The indication is that he would have shots of a similar quality in terms of a similar frequency to Ødegaard, for example. And so really that moves us on to the classification, the prices, because what it all boils down to, you could have skipped all of the first 18 minutes of this video and just listened to this bit, because this is the most important bit. We need to know how he's going to be classified and how he's going to be priced, because he was a centre forward last year in FPL. Well, he was a forward in FPL, having played centre forward a lot for Chelsea, and he played centre forward a lot again. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a world where, simply because of that, FPL towers go, that man's a forward, and he gets classified as a forward again. Now, he has moved to Arsenal before the game has launched, and so I can also envisage a world where FPL look at the situation at Arsenal, they look at who's on the roster, and they're very, very aware of the fact that Havertz is probably not going to play centre forward there, and then classify him as a midfielder. Now, the second of those two is the one I would prefer. The former of those two choices is the one I would expect, because there's an element of consistency here. If you turn around and say he's a midfielder, despite the fact that last year he played a forward, it's shaky ground, I think, possibly. Now, that's just my personal opinion on how positions have been done before. in an ideal world, I'd like it if he was a midfielder. That would be really nice, because that would just help him potentially ask a little bit more of a question of fantasy managers. Because when you consider that Saka was in the 8 million bracket last year, Ødegaard and Martinelli were in the 6.5s to start with, but by the end of the season were widely owned by everybody. Saka, Ødegaard, and Martinelli are in the team of the year. Jesus probably would have been if he hadn't had that injury. Jesus his price might stabilise. It might sort of plateau because his overall numbers for the season in terms of raw numbers rather than per 90 maybe wasn't good enough for him to go up to a 10 million. You could argue. And so he might be the cheaper version compared to a Martinelli, Ødegaard and Saka, who I think most people are expecting to go up to 8.5, 9 million, possibly. They've more than justified those prices. Now, has Havertz justified being priced in that bracket if he's a midfielder? Absolutely not. And so most of the predictions I'm seeing right now are sort of Havertz as a 7 million, 7.5. And so if that happens, and he's a good 1.5 million cheaper than Saka, Ødegaard and Martinelli, and hits the ground running, I wouldn't be surprised if 2 or 3 weeks into the season, people move to Havertz based purely on value. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that I think he is going to hit the ground running, but there's enough here that I can see that if he were to hit the ground running, I wouldn't be enormously shocked. And the final thing on this is just Arsenal's fixtures. Arsenal's fixtures are very nice at the start of the season, and if Havertz was looking for a platform with which to hit the ground running, he couldn't really have asked for a better run of fixtures than this, in my opinion. You've got 4 of the first 6 are at home, and the first one is at home against Nottingham Forest. That's going to be a big confidence booster because I think we all expect that to be a big win for Arsenal. Then the next home game is Fulham at home. United at home game week 4 is a difficult one, but we know that United can concede lots of goals against the big teams, and Arsenal can score lots of goals against the big teams as long as they're not Man City. And then game week 6, home against Spurs. Well, this new Spurs team are going to be all out attack from what we can see about Postecoglou. So that's probably going to be a high-scoring game, a 4-3, something like that. So those first 4 home games for Arsenal, lots of goals available for them there. At least 2 of them are going to be games where you'd expect them to dictate possession, and therefore those 2 number 8s are very much going to really just be looking at consolidating into the box rather than necessarily having to drop back and help out, especially in a world where there's inverted fullbacks. So I do think, especially in those first 2 games, that Ødegaard and Havertz, if they're the 2 that start those games, can have a good time. And, if we are, as I said, looking for the best possible start for Havertz to hit the ground running, could be that. It could be that. The away games also look quite nice. Crystal Palace away in game week 2, Everton away game week 5. And they don't get worse necessarily moving further beyond the first 6. Bournemouth away game week 7 looks nice. City at home game week 8, of course, is a challenging one. Chelsea away game week 9, who knows really? We don't really know what impact Pochettino is going to have at Chelsea, but you wouldn't be surprised if it took a little while and Arsenal went there as favourites. Sheffield United at home game week 10. So, there's strong justification to be fairly heavily invested in Arsenal over those first 10 games. And how you do it is going to be a difficult question, because a lot of the players that you want to have in your team naturally are going to be massively hiked up in price. And so with Saka, Ødegaard, Martinelli and Jesus all almost certainly over 8.5 million, if Havertz has hit the ground running, I don't know. Maybe he's the way in. He could be the way in. Let's find out. The final thing that will help you work that out is, of course, the pre-season. And we're very fortunate this year because of the way the pre-season is panning out in terms of the commercial and marketing side, because we've got a lot of Premier League teams going to America, playing other big teams in just a way of being able to showcase Premier League football all over the globe. And that, I think, is going to make for a pre-season where we're going to see a lot more teams having to sort of, under probably commercial pressure, play their best teams, or at least try to play their best teams, from the off in pre-season, which they would be incentivized to anyway, because you want to get your first 11 prepped and ready to go. But I think that we're going to see a lot of high-quality games in the pre-season, which should tell us a lot about who's playing where, how much for, what role they're having. And so all of the questions that we sort of have still in our mind about Havertz's role at Arsenal, can he replicate what Xhaka does defensively there? Is that going to mean that maybe he plays for 60 minutes and then they take him off and bring Partey on for the last half an hour just to shore things up, for example?
all of those different things we'll see in the preseason. And that is a good opportunity for me to push to you the Fantasy Football Scout preseason page, some of which is part of the Fantasy Football Scout membership. So we'll start with the preseason page. It's just your absolute Bible of everything you need to know about the start of the new season, covering all of the preseason games and I was going to say excruciating detail, but that makes it sound like it's painful. But it won't be. It'll be very, very useful for you. It will tell you who's playing, how long they're playing for, how many minutes they've got, what roles they're playing in, who's getting the goals, who's getting the assists for all those preseason games on the preseason minute spreadsheet as well, which famously discovered Aaron Wan-Bissaka and John Lundstrom when they were 4.0 million defenders. So make sure you check that out, because that will tell you what role Havertz is having in the preseason for Arsenal. So make sure you check that out. Also, Fantasy Football Scout membership as well, because some of what I've just discussed there is part of the membership package as well. Head to fantasyfootballscout.co.uk, go up to the top menu and click on Members Benefits and pick the package that is best for you. Absolutely sure it will help you win your FPL mini leagues and get one over your mates, so you can find out all those tips before they've even created their account, because it's that time of year where you can start doing a lot of that pre-planning. Well, that's everything from me. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't remind you to like this video, subscribe to the Fantasy Football Scout YouTube channel, and hit that bell notification. It is that time of year when you really need those notifications to know when the content is out, because there's no deadlines with which to shape your schedule for checking out the content, so make sure you've done that. And with that, I shall leave you fine folks to enjoy the rest of your summer, and I will see you next time.